Hello, we're at TCT in San Francisco, and I'm really pleased to be here with Tom Johnson and Peter Kane, my good friends, and also co-investigators in the SELUTION trial, which we have just heard presented at an amazing opening late-breaking session at TCT. So, Peter, you were the UK PI and actually enrolled a lot of these patients. What was it like doing this study?
So, first of all, very pleased with our performance as a United Kingdom. We put in a third of the patients in the whole study, which is a real credit to all the investigators in the United Kingdom. In terms of the protocol, it was a clever design. So unlike some other DCB versus stent trials, this was a trial that was designed as a strategy trial. So the randomization occurred before lesion preparation, which is unusual and is a key difference when we have to think about any comparisons. And that meant that we had to be sure as operators that we could achieve a result with DCB and get away with a good result in the same way as we would with a conventional stent. So it allowed us to put in quite complex cases, which we were able to then randomize, having got the angiographic images. And the patients were randomized to either the DCB approach or the stent approach. We would end up spending some time preparing the vessels, perhaps using different devices such as specialty balloons, cutting, scoring and so forth. And then we'd be in a position where we'd have lesion preparation suitable for DCB. In the stent group, it would be conventional operator choice as to how the vessel was prepared and then a stent in according to our usual guidance. Some of that was imaging in the UK, but not, of course, globally throughout the whole study. Now, in terms of the ability to bail out stent, that was an option as well. So it was built into the calculation that we could have up to 30% of the stent of the DCB group patients who could be crossed over to stenting if two reasons. One is you had recoil more than 30%, or secondly, you had a dissection that was greater than a type B, i.e. a flow limiting dissection. In the end, that bailout rate was only 20% overall in the study, which I think is quite commendable.
So it was a non-inferiority study design, which meant that there was a pre-specified margin within, if the results fell within that, it would be considered non-inferior. And in particular, I think the predicted event rate, the MACE rate was 6%, which meant that in order to meet non-inferiority, the upper bound of the confidence interval of the difference in MACE rates would have to be within that margin. And because it was a 50% non-inferiority margin, a 6% MACE rate would mean that the upper bound would have to be below 3%. So, Tom, did the study meet its endpoint?
Yes, I'm not a statistician, but I do understand that the way that this trial was designed has some novelty in terms of that 50% bound rather than absolute value for the non-inferiority margin. So as you said, they actually had great difficulty in estimating the likely 1-year event rate composite of target vessel failure. They estimated it to be around 6%, but by going for a 50% difference on the non-inferiority margin meant they hadn't set an absolute where if the event rates actually ended up being lower, that might then be detrimental to the likelihood of achieving non-inferiority. So as it happens, the event rates were 5.3 in the DCB arm and 4.4 in the DES arm, so the absolute difference of 0.9 was seen between the two groups, and that met the non-inferiority margin, which I think played out at 2.44%. Absolute difference was the upper bound of the limit.
That's right. I think the upper bound is 2.44. The non-inferiority margin was 2.44 and the upper bound was 2.38, I think. So it fell within it, which meant that as the study was designed, the use of drug-coated balloons was non-inferior to that of stenting. Do you think the stent arm event rates are what you would expect, 5.3% target vessel failure at 1 year?
Yeah, I think actually, it's still a low event rate at 1 year, and Peter's already indicated that actually the complexity of this trial in terms of the patients that were put in were real world. Certainly the experience from Bournemouth, from Bristol, from the UK operators for which we met regularly and shared cases highlighted that this was a real world population with really very significant complexity. there's been an interesting issue around the use of core lab, and so for the moment angiographic data hasn't been shared. But what we did see was that the complexity defined by AHA, ACC, B2C, 2/3 of the cohort had either B2 or C angiographic complexity, and a high rate of calcification as well.
So real world and fairly complex lesions. So I mean, this is a very important result in terms of efficacy, that it really doesn't seem to be inferior. But one of the questions on people's minds when in the lead up to this was, is it safe? Because stents were introduced to deal with acute problems in the cath lab or the few hours thereafter. What do you make of the results in terms of the safety data?
Well, I mean, that's one of the great things about the trial. Antonio Colombo, as a discussant in the presentation, quite elegantly put it that this is the first landmark trial really in this era that's really demonstrated that it is a very safe position to leave a vessel looking perhaps like some people would want to put a stent in. You don't have to. The event rate for those patients is extremely low. So abrupt closure, lesion thrombosis, as you might describe it, rather than stent thrombosis, was very low. Stent thrombosis was very low in this group as well, which I think also attains to the fact that these were done by experienced operators, and the event rates for those perhaps lower than you might expect from, it was a multitude of different drug-eluting stents. They weren't all the same drug-eluting stent, that wasn't mandated. So I think the fact that all these event rates are low is very good. It's good for both arms. It suggests that these were high quality cases. But the mantra that you have to put a stent in to go to sleep at night and not worry about the patient, I think is now being completely resolved.
And I think that's a really important new data that will help us. That you don't have to put a stent in. And I know from having spoken to you both off camera that there were some pretty horrible looking dissections which before the trial we may not have been happy to leave. Now, imaging. There wasn't a lot, Tom, I'm going to come to you obviously with that question. There wasn't a lot of imaging used in this trial. But do you think if imaging had been used that it would affect both arms equally, or may it have helped the stent arm more?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, imaging, I think, is a key issue, and it was raised during the session that the rates were really relatively low when considering a 1A guideline recommendation now for complex stenting, but that is complex stenting. So the rates were in the order of 17% in both arms, balanced between both groups. I think the reality is actually the UK rates were much higher than that. They were probably above 50%. So the UK imaging rate probably drove that 17%. As Christian said in the answer to one of the discussants, actually 17%, whether it's DCB or DES, reflects standard practice in most regions of the world. So I don't think we can be criticised for the fact that that was the rate that we perceived. Having said that, I would wonder whether the imaging may play a greater role in the stenting arm than it would the DCB arm. But the reality is we've still got lots to learn in terms of how imaging should be applied and should guide us in our decision making in a DCB strategy.
Sure. So I think the imaging sub-study would be really interesting on the assumption that those centers that do imaging did equal amounts of imaging in both arms will have some very interesting data coming out of that.
I mean, I think to extend that, the reason, well, I mean, a number of reasons for why imaging wasn't recommended and certainly not mandated in the study was a concern that imaging might push operators towards provisional stenting within the DCB arm because it's undoubtedly going to demonstrate greater vessel injury. And actually, I think the experience, I speak for both Peter and I, because it was again came up in some of the later discussions this morning, was that actually it was complete opposite. That what the imaging provided you, if you're relatively mature in the adoption, is that the injury that you saw by imaging and marrying that with the information that you get or don't get from angiography actually led to giving you greater reassurance to leaving the DCB kind of DeNovo treatment without having to bail out or provisionally stent. So as I say, I think there's more to learn.
But let's get to the point. How is this going to change our practice? So we've got a trial that's shown that balloon technology, drug-coated balloon technology, is non-inferior. There was a higher event rate in the drug-coated balloon arm, but it wasn't statistically significant, and it was within pre-specified non-inferiority margins. But it was no better. It was just not appreciably worse. Given that that's the efficacy and safety and efficacy result, and the fact that around the world, this technology is actually more expensive, how do you think it's actually going to affect our practice?
It's a big question. I mean, the chosen endpoint is a composite endpoint. And I guess the thing that interests me is if I can not put a stent in, then I'll try and not put a stent in. But there are some lesions where no matter what I've done, and I don't want to spend too much money to get to that point, I can't get rid of recoil. And those cases probably don't do as well with the stent. So i.e. the target lesion failure rate of that will be higher. And we need to explore that in more detail. But I think a lot of cases, as the study has shown, that 4 out of 5 cases you don't need to put a stent in. There is a crossover rate. There's some cases you have to put a stent. But if you don't need to put a stent in, why are we putting so many stents in? And to me, that's a massive change in practice. And whether the community will come around to that idea or not, whether they'll just stick with their stents, I don't know. But for me, it's moving forward now is trying to identify that 1 in 5 cases that we don't get away with a stent, or we don't get away with balloon, and also trying to identify the cases where how do we predict that it's not going to work? Because I think some cases will be better with a stent for the recoil phenomenon more than anything else.
But as
and the imaging might help.
But as we said at the beginning, it's a strategy trial. It's a strategy of having an upfront plan to do a DCB. It doesn't preclude the use of stents in those cases where you have recoil.
Exactly.
So perhaps the future is a nuanced approach and an individualized to what you're seeing in front of your eyes in the cath lab.
And I just pick you up on, you said it's only non-inferior. It was only ever intended to be non-inferior at 1 year. And I think the challenge and the most exciting element of the result of this study is that where the concern was abrupt closure, early issues, we've shown safety in terms of the strategy approach, and it's met the non-inferiority. The next step of the planned analysis is for a 5-year non-inferiority with then assessment of superiority, with the expectation being that actually this approach of leaving nothing behind in 80% of the DCB arm means we then don't have any of the downstream concerns of the stent and the subsequent risks of stent failure in year 1 to 5. So really the next part of this story is tracking to the 5-year event time point to see actually
to look at durable outcome.
Whether there may then be superiority of not having left stents behind.
Yeah. Tom, Peter, thank you
very much
joining me in this discussion. I mean, it's not often we see paradigm-changing trials. There's a lot that we need to think about and more data to come out, imaging long-term, etc.
Definitely.
But this has been a good day to be at TCT.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay.